Okay, this is week 3. This week we're going to go over settings and contrast. We'll first go over exposure, and then leading lines and rule of thirds, then in-class exercise, and then we'll go over your take-home. Let's talk about exposure first. Light is good. The amount of light exposed to a film or image is what exposure is all about. Exposure is controlled by the film speed, or with digital cameras, image sensor sensitivity, shutter speed, and aperture. So sensor, shutter speed, and aperture for today's digital cameras. The amount of exposure is dependent upon the sensitivity of the capturing medium or image sensor. We talked last week about the quality of images has more to do with the quality and the sensitivity of the sensor versus how many megapixels a camera might have. Here's an example of a photo with the ISO set at 100, aperture at 2.8. Remember, aperture number, the lower the number is, the wider the opening. The higher the number, the smaller the opening. So this is ISO 2.8, and from the left to the right is the shutter speed. You'll notice as it comes from the left to the right, it gets lighter and more white, washed out type of effect. ISO 100 is a very low setting for ISO. And remember, ISO on your camera fakes out the camera sensor to light. And so it compensates if it's good light or bad light. A lower ISO would mean light is fairly good already. A higher ISO means you need to help fake the sensor out to the light that's not in the room or the outside that you're taking. 2.8, medium range aperture. And again, it has to do with the whole opening in the camera to let the light into the sensor. So proper exposure can make or break a picture. Exposure can change the appearance of a picture. In this example here, you'll note upper left and upper right, and then bottom middle. This is called the EV setting, exposure value, that a lot of your cameras have. They have like the plus and minus button on the camera somewhere. -1, 0, and +1. 0 in exposure value is supposed to be as the light is. -1 would make it darker. +1 would add light to it. Out of these three, I would say probably the +1 fits better to make the exposure look best. Now let's talk about histograms. All of your cameras have histograms, and it allows you to see how good the exposure is by looking at a histogram. In my opinion, the histogram is one of the most important features of your camera. Histograms is a graph that gives the relative amount of light and darkness in a picture. Towards the left of the histogram here is a dark spectrum. All the way to the right would be the white spectrum. What you're going to want in a histogram as you're viewing it in your camera is kind of a valley type of effect, meaning that's going to be good, mid-tone, great exposure. So each square represents a pixel of brightness. The histogram displays each pixel collected. 0 is pure black and 255 is pure white. And you'll notice in this example here, most are in the tonal range in the midtones, which for the most part means a good histogram. If light is over here, if it's too dark, it's going to be maybe over here. If it's too light, it's going to be over in this area tonal range is where most of the pixels are found. You can analyze your picture well by looking at a histogram. There's no perfect histogram, but what you're looking for is broad tonal ranges, few midtones, plenty of highlights and shadows. In this case here, you'll notice where the histogram falls. Got some whited out area in here. It's going to be towards this part of the spectrum, which is more light, more white. And whereas over in here, it's going to be most dark. And you'll notice in the middle of this histogram, there's not many midtones because there's really a lot of, it's either all dark or too much light in this photo. And so really, as far as contrast goes or exposure goes, not that great. But there is sometimes you want those type of effects, like a dark, dreary effect possibly for your photos. So histograms just help you see it as it is, basically. This is an average histogram. You'll notice it's peak and valley towards the middle tone, plenty of midtones, an ideal subject because a camera can get most of the midtones. Most cameras' meters will have no problem reading this scene. Now let's look at some different types of histograms. A high key, like this one here, is going to be more whitewashed and pixelated maybe. And you'll see because the peak is towards the right of the histogram, which is more white. A low key means it's mostly dark, and so this one is going to be very hard. Both of these, high and low key, very hard to post-production do much with. An underexposed is like this here. Wasted space, meaning zero, nothing in here for histogram, will generally mean it's very underexposed. Overexposed, you'll notice, push towards the left a little bit, and the stuff that is on the right is real clipped. And what it means by clipped is in these areas here where my mouse is pointing to are very clipped and they cannot be recovered. Which brings me to this scene here. The clips of the highlights can never be recovered. So down here, it's so much clipped in this that it's impossible to recover those post-production, or very difficult to. Maybe not impossible, but very difficult. So we've talked about exposure. Let's go into contrast now. Contrast is a measure of the difference between light and dark areas. Here's a low contrast example. Here's a high contrast. Low contrast looks very dull. High contrast looks very sharp and jaggedy. Bringing it into the histogram world, a low contrast will be very peaked in the middle with no histogram really on the left or the right. Images tend to be flat and dull, pictures taken during a fog time. On the right, high contrast, it does have a fairly good mid-range tone, but look at the choppiness of that peak and valley. Usually in this case, it's very strong daylight, a lot of bounce of light. This could also happen outside with snow in midday. What this is looking at is it's taking an image, one image, and breaking it down into what the histograms would look as each part of the image. So the top part in and of itself would look like this. All of it's pretty much taking up the whole picture. The subject would be from left to right, so not much variation, pretty dull and boring. This part here, a little bit more interesting because you do have a lot of midtones and a lot of good contrast. And the bottom does have peak and valleys, and because it's a shadow in the water, that's going to happen. And so really all three of these are not too bad as far as histograms go. So what we're looking at here is it's taking the three histograms on this slide and putting them all together. All right, so you have the top, middle, and bottom equals a good histogram, and them all combined together. Here's an example of a outside scene with a tree, background, sky, mountains. The only problem with this is when you're looking at the histogram, you can tell it's kind of dark because of the peaks going towards the left. So it is what it is. You can tell just by looking at the histogram, though, it's going to be kind of dark. As we talked about already, how your LCD viewer and even the monitor sometimes that you view your pictures on can be deceiving to the actual reality of the photo. Histograms, though, are helpful because they are just giving you data, basically. So Goldilocks are the three histograms. This one would be too dark or underexposed, too light or overexposed, just right, correct exposure, a lot of midtones, peak and valley, and to the right and to the left, both going dark and going light, white, is a good, pretty good gradual climb and pretty good gradual going down as well. Here's an example of a maybe artistic type of photo of a sunset, and you'll notice it's real jaggedy. You know it's going to be both over and underexposed, but it might be something that you look for where you kind of break the rules and you're wanting some type of artistic type of look. This one, very much towards the left, a peak, and that would actually be this area here, but then everything else is real white out, kind of whitewashed effect. Next, overexposed, and not midtones at all, no midtones whatsoever, tonal ranges. This one, very much so underexposed and very much dark, not much light. This one, though, might actually be cool for an artistic type of photo. Underexposed, very dark, and even maybe give a bluer type of a tint to the photo. A tree in a snowstorm, very whitewashed towards the white side, but again, might be something you look for in photography for a photo that you're taking for outside. An outdoor situation where we've all taken pictures, maybe with flash. The total back of the photo is totally black. The subject is well lit, and that's it. And that's where this mid-tone part here comes right here, but everything else is underexposed. This example here just talks about these next few, the different speeds and aperture and ISO as it refers to the histogram. Here we have a shutter speed of 1/180th of a second, 180th of a second, aperture 2.8, and a very low ISO of 50. So very underexposed, very dark. This is the opposite. Overexposed, shutter speed 1/60th of a second, so pretty quick. Actually pretty slow on that one. Aperture 2.8, and ISO is 200. So the ISO is bumped up to give it kind of a whitewashed effect. Shutter speed 1/160th of a second, aperture 5.8 f8, and ISO 200. And we can tell here by the upper left and right, it's kind of under and overexposed both. 1/100th of a second, 2.8. ISO here is unknown, but mostly dark, a few midtones. And I want to go now to the contrast. So, this article here is by a photographer from Arizona Highways magazine, and he's a director of photographer called Peter Eisenberger, and it's called Improving Your Photography. I want to go over it real quick. It's not a real long article, but he talks about in recent talk column, he said he discussed developing an awareness of light and relationship to the subjects in your photographs. Light and shadow become an integral part of the composition when skillfully incorporated. and should be first consideration before setting up to make a photograph. When lighting conditions have been evaluated and the camera position chosen to take the best advantage of the light and subject, the next step is composing it. So what he's saying is, first you have to have light. Good light you can't replace before you do anything else. Look for good lighting. Second paragraph goes on and says, composing a photograph is essentially an editing process, deciding what to leave in, what to leave out. There are basic accepted criteria for good composition when applied, and will help you achieve visual harmony and dynamic tension. Faithfully following all the rules of composition will not necessarily culminate in a good photograph. The rules are intended just as guidelines, more than strict dogma. But they'll help you design a well-balanced image that's pleasing to the eye. While it may be a subject that initially attracts viewers to stop and look at an image, it is the artistry of the composition that hold them there. So he now goes into some basics of composition of a photo. This first one is let me go ahead and zoom in on this a little bit. The first one here is a picture of a person on the edge of a ledge. Tree, valley, sun. And so what this is talking about is a very strong focal point. It's usually best to have one main subject in the photograph. It doesn't have to be the largest, as in this case here, but you need to have one focal point because a photograph can successfully tell only one story. The main subject can be object or several, may include a secondary object, but make sure nothing distracts from the focal point. Lacking a strong character center of interest forces a viewer to search for something else. Rule of thirds. The exact center of any composition is not a satisfying place for the viewer's eye to come to rest. We talked about this last week in class. He goes on and says the main subject placed in the center, with the main subject placed in the center, the viewer is less likely to explore the rest of the photograph. In fact, it's preferable to keep the viewer's eyes moving. To create movement in a photograph and avoid static bullseye, use a rule of thirds guidelines for off-center placement of the main subject. It's a traditional way to create a well-balanced composition and has been used by artists for centuries. To apply the rule of thirds, imagine the scene in your viewfinder divided into 3 horizontal and vertical lines, into thirds by horizontal and vertical lines, similar to a tic-tac-toe. So you place the main subject and other points of elements across the grid lines at the points where the grid lines intersect. What I like to call them is the 4 quadrants, 4 dots of the intersection. So it'll be this, this, and this. He goes on and says, place the main subject and other elements of your composition along the grid lines. Employing the rule of thirds not only helps avoid symmetry or symmetrical composition, but also provides a pleasing proportion of space around the subject to prevent distracting tension between the focal point and the edge of the frame. So you look at an image through your viewfinder, whether or not it has a grid or not, you can visually kind of figure out where things are at and what quadrant. And then you place that focal point in the upper area, lower area, and towards the intersecting points here. He goes on to say the common compositional faux pas occurs when the horizon is positioned directly through the middle of the frame. And he goes on and talks about how it's recommended, utilizing the rule of thirds, that the horizon be placed on either one of the grid lines. So he's talking about either down here, below this third, or up here, the top third. So bottom third or top third would be good for your horizon. In this example here is the case. It's bringing up most of it is the horizon is a bottom third. Everything else is the sky and clouds. Example here, Very little sky and clouds, mostly the land and water. So in this case, the horizon is on the upper third. And lastly, I'm going to talk about simplicity. He goes in and talks about the best way to present a clear message in a photograph is to keep the composition simple. The fewer elements you have to work with, the easier it is to design a pleasing image and control the viewer's movement. There are several simple things to do in composition. The primary method is to move it closer to the subject. Photojournalist Robert Capa said it best, if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. Whether you physically move the camera position closer or zoom in optically, getting closer allows you to fill the frame in the subject, paring the composition down to essential components. It removes visual distractions from the edges of the frame, eliminates superfluous elements, and defocuses the background. Shallow depth of field helps to isolate the subject from a busy background by blurring objective clutter, and may even create soft pulls of complementary color behind the subject. Here's an example here where the photographer gets up close to these lines in the sand and really jumps out to you, which brings to the last one, which is leading lines. Another compositional technique is to create energy, movement in a photograph is adding leading lines. Whether they're graceful curves or dynamic diagonals, all the lines should lead the viewer's eye to the focal point. Be careful, though, he says, with using leading lines. They can work against you by directing the eye away from the subject, or if the line divides the photograph into two, leading it right out of the image. He ends with a few factors to consider on composition. First is let the lines in your composition decide if the scene should be shot horizontally or vertically, and all of your cameras will let you do that, taking a portrait or a landscape. If the scene presents long vertical lines, compose vertically to take advantage of them. When presented with strong horizontal lines, use a horizontal camera position. This plays the strength of composition, also avoids wasted space at the edge of the frame. Secondly, be aware of white or light areas in your composition. The viewer's eyes will always go to the brightest part first, so eliminate bright spots that pull away. A trick in this point I've found over the years is just if you are taking a picture outside or even inside and there's a light spot somewhere, whether it be a light or whether it be the sun, you can move your camera away from that just a little bit to where it's not distracting to the subject. Thirdly, he goes on and says, look for repetition for shapes and textures. Patterns create rhythm, motion, and composition. Fourthly, compose boldly and use sweeping diagonal lines. Long horizontal lines can be static and visually boring. Conversely, diagonal lines add visual energy. This is easily accomplished by changing the camera's angle to pivot prevailing lines. So you can physically turn the camera rather than being just straight horizontal or vertical. You can tilt it a little bit to add in those diagonal type of lines. He goes on, talks about wide angle lens. You don't need to use that this semester, but he does say with wide angle lenses, you can compose a foreground, middle ground, background with overlapping compositional elements to create a three-dimensional effect. So that's the two articles I wanted to read on exposure and contrast. Now let's go over the in class. What you're going to do with this one is look at your camera, and you're going to give all of the dial settings on your camera. Some of your cameras don't have dials, I know, it's a digital menu. Whether it be digital or on the dial itself, I want you to put in this, submit this assignment. An example would be on this camera, it had auto, aperture mode, ISO mode, movie mode, close-up, sports, PA, M, and TV. So you put exactly what's on your camera and submit it. That's the in class. The take home this week is you're going to create a photo album on Foki, week 3. And in this exercise, what I want you to do is you're going to walk around campus. I know we're not here this week on campus, so you can use your house, you can use wherever you're at currently. And I want you to take pictures, at least 3 pictures, of each of the below settings that give itself to good contrast. After transferring the image to your computer, name them, and then upload them into week 3 album. And we'll go over them next week. You're going to focus this week on these settings, ISO and white balance. And focus on auto and preset with white balance. Do not use manual white balance this week. So ISO I definitely want you to play with. And then white balance. White balance, auto, and preset. Most of your cameras on ISO will have like a 100, 200, 300 level. So here's what it's going to do. You're going to take these types of photos around your home, around your work, in the next week. The first type of photo setting, and what I mean by photo setting, is outside of the camera, the subject you're taking a picture of, the photo setting, the photo subject. The first setting is nature. Location, and this one I want you to describe the settings on your camera to make the contrast better. So basically, white balance, ISO, and then choose the best. So an example, say you chose the gazebo by the Student Center. And what I'm wanting you to do for all of these, by the way, is choose the same ISO for each one of these photo settings. So for nature, you're going to do nature 1 when you save it to your computer, 200, say 200 is the ISO, sunny white balance. The second photo of the gazebo, 300 ISO. On the white balance, you're going to choose shade white balance. And then 400 ISO, auto white balance. So you can look at all 3 of those photos and decide maybe, hey, this one here in the middle, the 300 ISO shade white balance, that looked the best at the end of the day when it comes to exposure. But you'll get a chance to look at what looks not so great with the other 2. All right, so that's nature. Next is people gathering. Example on this one is, again, you're going to describe the settings on your camera, and I want those settings to be the same as you're using here for nature. So 200 ISO, sunny white balance, 300 ISO, sunny white balance, 400 ISO, auto white balance. Example, this one is maybe the Student Center. You'll name it when you save it to your computer and decide which one of the 3 looks best. Say you might look at all 3 of them and say, okay, the 300 ISO again looks best in the people gathering. Vehicles is the next one. Vehicles, example might be the WTC parking lot. 200 ISO sunny, 300 ISO shade white balance, 400 ISO auto white balance. And out of these 3, you say, after looking at them, the first one looks best. So when you upload all of these photos up to this point, we've got 3, 3, and 3. We've got 3 here, 3 for nature, 3 for people, and 3 for vehicles. You'll upload those to Foki. You'll label them just as I've labeled them here, except yours may be different depending on your location. Yours might not be the Student Center. Yours might be out in the, at the mall or something, okay? And maybe out behind your house or something might be the nature one. So basically what you're going to do on this one is just choose a location, nature 1, nature 2, nature 3, people 1, people 2, people 3, and vehicles 1, vehicle 2, vehicle 3. Under each picture, you'll put exactly what I have here as the example, except you'll also put on the 3, like say you upload the 3 vehicle photos, say in your example that you've uploaded, maybe this one looks the best as far as exposure, so you're going to put parentheses around this one and leave the other 2 alone. Other location, This is to whatever you want to go take a picture at, wherever you want to take a picture at. It might be the mall, it might be your job. So same type of setting as we've done before here as far as photo camera setting, except photo setting where you're taking it at the other location. That's your choice on this number 4. But I do want you to use 200 ISO auto white balance, 300 ISO auto white balance, and 400 also ISO auto white balance on this one. So on the last one, the last example, I want you to do with the last example auto white balance on all 3, but keep the same ISO as you've done on the nature, people gathering, and vehicles. When you're finished, you'll upload those 3 as well, those 3 photos, label them in Foki, and put best under the one that's the best. So here's an example of what could be submitted for this week in your Foki account for week 3. So you'll have week 3's photo album, and these 3 for nature. These 3 will be uploaded for people. These 3 uploaded for vehicles, and these 3 uploaded for, say, you went to the mall, the food court. And label them just like I've labeled them here. And that is for week 3 take-home contrast exercise. Submitting for this exercise, basically what you're going to submit for this exercise is exactly what I put here on the example here. You're going to submit below the URL for your Foki site, Foki album. And since you're labeling them on Foki in the album itself as a label, as a comment, in fact, I think on Foki you can actually do both. You could do a label like name of the photo itself, could be this, or it might be easier just for you to put a comment under each photo that describes that photo. All right. So what you need to submit in this week is just a URL to your photo site, your album on Foki, and then make sure under each photo that you've uploaded, so you should end up with 9 photos that you've uploaded, make sure you put it in the comment section of each photo, the description as is here. All right, and that concludes week 3 take home. If you have any questions about that, you can definitely email me. But again, just to recap, you're taking, in the next week, walking around home, campus, work, and taking 3 photos of nature. Make sure it's the very same setting. So if it's nature outside your backyard, it's in the very same area 3 times. You're going to take that photo, the same camera shot 3 times, and you're going to change the camera settings for the photo to 200 sunny white balance, 300 shade white balance, and 400 auto white balance. Then you'll find somewhere where there's people gathering, 200 ISO sunny, 300 ISO shade, 400 ISO auto. And then vehicle somewhere, 200 ISO sunny, 300 ISO shade, 400 ISO auto. And then finally, other location. This one's a little bit different as far as the white balance. They're all going to be auto, but you are going to keep the same increment as you've done before on the other 3. 200, 300, and 400 for the ISO, but all auto white balance. You'll upload all those photos. Make sure and put in the comment which one's best out of all 4 sections. So you'll have the nature section, people section, vehicle, and other. All right. And again, if you have any questions, give me a holler as far as via email. I'd be more glad to help you, but it should be hopefully fairly simple for you. And you'll get a chance to see the differences in the ISO settings. What just a little bit of difference, 100 ISO difference is in a photo, and the different types of effects different types of white balance has on your camera as well, on your photos as well. Next is the photography terms. This is basically just a document that you need to study the next week, because in week 4 you're going to have a little quiz when you come to class on photography terms. So go over the terms, memorize the definitions, the descriptions of each one of these terms. The quiz next week will be matching, so we're going to take it right at the first of the class. So just take this next week and study your photography terms. So that concludes week 3. Hope everybody has a great week, and I will see you next week.